All right, and we're live. Um, I am joined with my friend, the Prison Island Man, and Vlad. You guys want to introduce yourselves real quick?
Hi there, Prison Island Head. It's nice to be on another stream, Avi. What about
Hey,
you, Vlad?
I'm Vladivostok 3701. I have a YouTube channel where I discuss Canadian politics. And yeah.
Yeah.
All right, excellent. And so we will just jump right into it. I guess we're going to start out with the history of opioids and their introduction, which I just want to point out that the third largest industry in the United States is pharmaceutical. And of all of the pharmaceutical products produced in the world, 90% are kept inside the United States market. So it's a pretty big problem here in our backyard. So let's talk about it. You said 1992?
Yeah, well, before I get into the history of how the opioid crisis started, I think it's important just to illustrate how big of a crisis this is in North America.
Right.
Because if you look at of the amount of opiate overdoses in North America over time, you'll notice that the number has increased every single year since the early 2000s. And if you add all of those numbers, all the total deaths from opioid overdoses together since the early 2000s, it's in the several hundreds of thousands. That's just for like a comparison of the scope. That's more. That's actually like that's more than the number of Frenchmen who died during the Battle of Verdun in World War One. So we're talking about like
Which is a
war.
terrifying number.
Yeah. It's like the scale of the problem is like pretty much like on the level of a mass war.
And I think that's also higher than the number of gun deaths in the same amount of time in the United States, which kind of is interesting because that's something that everybody likes to focus on so much.
Yeah, it's higher than the amount of gun murders. It's higher than the amount of car crashes.
Oh, wow.
Staggering. And that's not even including the people who are hooked on opiates who don't overdose. Like all throughout, white suburbia, there are people who are just hooked on Percocet, on Oxycontin, who just zone out and watch TV all day, and just their lives are just ruined because they're hooked on this deadly drug that was prescribed to them by their doctor.
Which is kind of
And
interesting because I don't mean to take this in a Marxist direction, but one of the most famous quotes from Karl Marx is that religion was the opiate of the masses. And what he meant by that was that it kept them sedated and down and unable to lift themselves up. And it's interesting that we've gone from a sort of metaphorical opiate of the masses to a quite literal opiate of the masses.
yeah, you make a good point. Like if you were some sort of dictator and you wanted to keep a population sedated and complacent and stupid, then the way that you would do that is getting them hooked on a drug like opiates.
So, Brave New World.
Yeah.
Which is strange because in the 19th century, China and India actually, their governments were extremely against the use of opiates because it reduced the ability of their workers to be able to be productive. And so we're at this point now where the productivity of the average person in the country no longer matters to the people at the top.
Yeah. And if you look at the people who are most affected by the opiate crisis, it's lower class, working class whites between the ages of 25 to 34. That, like, if you look at the rate of mortality amongst that demographic since over the last 30 years, you'll see that it's steadily increased. And the reason for that is because of opiate overdoses.
And it's the same people that were the ones that were in the mines and in the factories and that were doing the jobs that were building the country, that were giving them some sort of sense of being and were allowing them to not only make money to sustain themselves, but to give themselves a purpose in that society. And those are the very structures which have been torn down. And I don't know. I guess
Yeah.
I kind of take sort of a philosophical look on the opioid crisis more so than an actual sort of mathematical look.
Yeah, it's really quite tragic because just several generations ago, the people who were most affected by opiates were the people who were, the salt of the earth Americans. They worked with their hands for a living. They worked in factories. They produced vehicles, and they had families. And now, in the current year, we don't have manufacturing is not as big of an industry anymore. So instead of having gainful employment, these people are just in a vegetative state, hooked on drugs, just wasting away their lives.
Just drugging themselves to death because that's the only way. That's the only way they know how to live now.
Yeah, and what are they supposed to do? Like what higher ideal are they supposed to use to lift themselves up? They could overcome the fear of the pain that they're going to incur by dropping these drugs, by saying that they're going to get a job at McDonald's. Like it's just there's no path through society to get these people to a position where they would be able to function in a way that they could use to overcome the fear of the pain which they will incur by getting off these drugs. And the fear of pain seems to be a large problem in our society, which I guess you could say is reflected directly by the opioid crisis in itself.
Yeah, opiate withdrawal is a really nasty thing. It's not, like getting off of, soda pop or smoking weed or something. Like opiate withdrawal causes massive side effects. I've when you read the stories of addicts who try to get off of off their opiate addiction, then it just sounds like it's hell on earth.
Yeah, and it's being produced by a company that's making a lot of money and is supposed to be promoting the general welfare of the people. And yeah, it helps to bring them down into this trap of a self-fulfilling prophecy of subservience, honestly.
Yeah, it's actually the story of how the opiate crisis came to be is actually really depressing. And if you don't mind, I kind of want to go into how it started.
Let's do it.
Go ahead, man.
So basically, the opiate, the firm responsible for this crisis is Purdue Pharmaceuticals. Now, Purdue, if you don't know, was the company responsible for creating Valium or marketing Valium back in the 60s and 70s. It was it's owned by the Sackler family. If you don't know, Arthur Sackler became he rose to fame by marketing Valium for basically all sorts of like restless leg syndrome and just general anxiety. Like somebody goes to the doctor and says, "Oh, I feel shy in social situations." So then the doctor says, "Here, have some Valium," and then all of a sudden, over time, they become addicts.
Well, I've heard that this is a problem with pharmaceuticals. It's like you have a video on the concept of mission creep, and I've heard that with new drugs, they have to say specifically what it is targeted towards, and then as they've been on the shelf longer, the company looks to increase the profit by expanding the market, and the way that they do that is by tagging on additional things which could be used to cure a drug, and a drug which simply gets you high and separates you from the hard fact of reality could technically be used to treat a lot of different conditions. So
yeah, including drug addiction.
Yeah, well, Valium is a benzodiazepine, and for those who don't know, benzodiazepines can have really harsh side effects, especially when you stop using them abruptly. It can result in just sudden death. So not only is Valium incredibly addictive, it's also potentially deadly in some situations, and it's also been shown to increase rates of suicide among people who are taking it. So it's certainly not a benign thing that Purdue had done back in the 60s when they mass marketed Valium to everybody. So bear this in mind when when we talk about the how they started the opiate crisis itself. So
it was a general
in
drug crisis
1992,
to begin with.
yeah. Well, yeah, they are like, I'm just trying to like establish a pattern of behavior. They've been doing this stuff since the 60s, and it's been owned by this same family, the Sackler family, which, if you didn't know, is one of the wealthiest families in the United States. They're actually more wealthy than the Rockefellers and the Mellons.
Yeah, I don't think people realize how much money there is in the pharmaceutical industry because they have the wealth to spend to quash any sort of animosity that anyone would be willing to bring up against them.
Exactly, and it's even more capricious when you realize that this mass fortune, this multi-billion-dollar fortune, is being made off the misery of other people. It's really sick. So Purdue Pharmaceuticals invented Oxycontin in 1992. And prior to 1992, doctors were very hesitant about prescribing opiates to patients because they understood the addictive potential that prescribing them to people was. The addictive potential of opiates. And even today in Europe, a lot of doctors are really hesitant about prescribing opiates to people. But then along comes Purdue Pharmaceuticals, and they invent this pill called Oxycontin. Oxycontin was marketed as a delayed release opioid. It's basically a form of oxycodone, which is a derivative of the Persian poppy. And the pill Oxycontin was designed with certain properties that it would release the drug into your system over the course of 8 to 10 hours. As a drug that had less potential for addiction because the high didn't hit the patient all at once. It was released over several hours. And the Sackler family with Purdue Pharma basically started this big mass marketing effort. They hired all these pharmaceutical sales reps to go to doctors and say, you need to prescribe Oxycontin to all your patients for any kind of pain. Moderate or severe or mild pain, you need to give them this pill because it has zero addictive potential and it's just some wonder drug, and it will solve all pain anywhere. And if you look at advertisements in the Canadian Medical Journal, there are it's pretty disgusting. They show one ad in particular shows a woman running up some stairs, and it says, when acetaminophen is not strong enough, try the next step in pain relief. And then, of course, it's an ad for Oxycontin. So the implication is that, you know, if you're a runner and you have some muscle fatigue in your legs, you can just take this opioid and you're going to be swinging. So, of course, in the late 90s and early 2000s, because of this marketing effort by Purdue Pharmaceuticals, you have all these doctors mass opiates to all their patients for anything. Like, you know, some guy comes in with a stubbed toe or, you know, a bruised a wrist or a sprained ankle, and the doctor gives them the mass amounts of deadly opioids. And what patients eventually figured out was that if you took this oxycodone tablet and you crushed it up and you either snorted it or injected it, it was more potent than a lot of the other opiates on the market. Because instead of having the drug released into your system over several hours, it hit you all at once. So, of course, it got so many people addicted. There were a mass amounts of overdoses. People were dying like crazy from this stuff. And eventually people started to realize this. So Purdue Pharmaceuticals in, I believe, 2007 was sued for about $1 billion, and the CEOs were sentenced to, I think, 400 hours of community service. But it was really, it was just a drop in the bucket because they made approximately $13 billion off selling Oxycontin in the United States and Canada. And the event, I don't know if you know this, but Oxycontin is no longer produced, called Oxy Neo. and that's marketed as being more having a less potential for addiction. Can't crush it or snort it, but obviously it's still being abused. Now, with Oxycontin no longer being produced, you have all these people who are addicted to opiates, and they're turning to the black market to get their fix because they can't go to the doctor to get this shit anymore. So in order to fill this massive demand, you're getting all this black market stuff that's being produced in basements. A lot of it is coming from China laboratories. It's being either mailed in or it's being brought in by immigrants. But because carfentanil and fentanyl, which are these replacement drugs, because they are so potent, they can be imported into the country in just tiny, tiny amounts. I read a story that talks about how carfentanil is being smuggled in urine test kits because you can put a tiny amount, like 30 milligrams, into a tiny urine test kit and smuggle it in the mail really easily. So it's not being detected, and because it's so potent, thousands of people in cities all across North America. The one city that's being hit the hardest by this crisis is Vancouver.
Which is interesting because Vancouver's being hit by a couple of different crises all at the same time.
Well, yeah, Vancouver, because of its relation to China, there are so many Chinese immigrants coming through that, of course, many of them are bringing this this bathtub-produced toxin with them, and it's going onto the streets of Vancouver, and it's killing.
And at the same time, Vancouver's like what, the third most expensive city in North America to own property?
Yeah. It's really terrible. Well,
yeah, like it's bad. And it just seems kind of strange that it would all be by coincidence. And I just wanted to add one thing to what you had said earlier about the company being sued and losing the lawsuit for $1 billion but gaining 12. That's a very common thing in a lot of, I mean, I think all of the top 5 largest corporate lawsuits have been against pharmaceutical companies, and they were all for extraordinary amounts of money like that. But they just sort of take it as a business operating expense that, you know, if you're going to make $15 billion, you're going to have to give 2 to the government because some people died. And that's a very horrible mindset for any sort of corporation, which is supposed to be benefiting people, to have as a corporate culture.
Well, yeah, this whole crisis is it goes to show not only that these companies like pharmaceuticals, that not only do they not care about their patients and people who they're supposed to be helping, but it also demonstrates a failure to fail to regulate these companies, because in addition to advertising to doctors to sell this pill to people, they also, of course, funded lobby groups. Lobby groups that was owned by Purdue Pharmaceuticals themselves was the trying to remember here. I think it's called the Patients for Pain, but there's all these other groups that were founded by Purdue Pharmaceuticals, like the Pain Institute, or the Doctors Against Pain, and these are all just lobby groups to.
They always choose the names
government.
that elicit the most sympathy, don't they? It's always it's never.
It's really deceptive and disgusting.
Yeah, it's fucking disgusting. It's never like the lobby for giving pharmaceuticals more money. It's never honest, is it?
Yeah, and there are several industries which are banned from any form of advertising whatsoever, and cigarettes is one of them. And the reason why you're not allowed to advertise cigarettes is because they're addictive and deadly. And so it seems sort of strange that another substance which is addictive and deadly would be allowed to openly advertise when the law already says that those sort of substances shouldn't be advertised.
Yeah. I mean, it just goes to show that many of the politicians who are supposed to represent us and represent our interests can be easily bought out by these corporations. And so they really don't have our interests at heart at all. Epidemic is not just a failure of these big corporations. As I said, it's a failure of our politicians, our leaders who are supposed to represent us. They've utterly failed in that respect. And nobody is raising this. Very few politicians are raising this point because they just don't care.
Yeah, and they don't care because it's not a political issue. It's not something that the average person put them in charge to care about, you know? And it's really bizarre how narrow the scope of politics has gotten in the past couple of decades. And the fact that politics is abortion versus not abortion, and gay marriage versus no gay marriage, and all of these kinds of things that really have very little, if any, effect on society, to be completely honest, and the much larger scope of why aren't our people having children? Why aren't our people doing as well as their grandparents? Why aren't our people not getting addicted to extremely harmful substances? These are way more important questions to the society, and yet they're totally outside the scope of the political conversation.
Yeah. I mean, like, it's just not. There's very little profit incentive for any politicians or businesses to raise this concern.
Right, and that's sort of an endemic problem in our society, is that our politicians shouldn't have a financial incentive to do anything, because their only incentive should be the fact that they're being elected, and they're being elected by people who care about issues. And I guess that's kind of what I'm trying to bring it down to, is like, we can say that it's a failing of our politicians, but at the end of the day, we vote for our politicians. And so I would say it's equally a problem of the people themselves. And why is it that we don't care that our neighbors are killing themselves unnecessarily, and that our society is sick, when we are the ones putting people in charge to manage these sorts of affairs?
I think it's the same reason why the politicians chase these issues like ambulance chases. It's because of the fact it catches our interest. We get really into it, and then we go on to the next topic. But the thing is, those topics never go into local elections, which is where we actually choose these politicians.
Right. Yeah. And people have definitely...
Imperator, you made a good point earlier about the how about this issue is basically a symptom of the breakdown of social capital. Like, in the past, in more healthier times of Western society, if your neighbor was hooked on Oxycontin and was in a vegetative state in front of his TV all day, take an interest in that. Like, you would have his welfare at heart, and you would do what you could to prevent him from getting off drugs. But nowadays, because our society is so fragmented and people don't care about their community or their neighbors or what's going on around them, there are various explanations as to why this is happening. But because that's happening, because of this decline in social capital, people just don't care if their neighbors or their countrymen are addicted to dangerous drugs.
Right. And promoting the general welfare is written into our United States Constitution, but it's become an idea that people hold above themselves. Like, it's not like I need to promote the general welfare of my people. It's more like some other person needs to worry about the welfare of our people.
Normally the government, honestly. I think that's the reason why there's always like a push for the government to sort out societal problems rather than people sort out their own problems.
But what is the government other than a tool of the people which empowers them to exist in the first place? And this sort of delegitimization of the actual citizens of a nation in favor of some sort of bureaucratized or managerial class, I would say, directly involves a lot of these problems that we're talking about.
Yeah, and for those who say that increased government purview over regulating pharmaceutical industries and things like that. For those who say that that's incompatible with a right-wing or a conservative worldview, here in Canada we have a philosophy called Red Toryism, and what that is, it's descended from the old British Parliament of the 18th and 19th century, and it was a philosophy that stated that we should have social conservative views and fiscal conservative views, but we should also take care of our fellow man, and we should also, care for our brethren.
Right.
And that it's a philosophy that's largely gone by the wayside in recent years.
So basically, economic right wing and socially left wing.
I mean, I would honestly say that social policy doesn't belong in government at all, personally.
I would argue that Red Toryism is both socially and fiscally right wing, where the welfare of the people has a more it's put as a higher priority than in more like Lockean individualist philosophies like that which prevails in the United States.
Right, and it's important to point out that the first 20 years that Britain had the NHS, they had enough money to fund it, and they had successful organizations. And 100 years ago in the United States, 70 years ago in the United States, we had big, large companies, and we also had people making money at jobs, and we had pensions, and we had healthcare, and we had a lot of other things. And today we have these same companies that are using literal slave labor in third world nations, and we don't have pensions, and we don't have high wages, and we're told that the economy is continually getting better and better, and that everything is okay, and yet there's no actual effect, and we're more in debt than we ever have been, and our corporations are more in debt than they've ever had been. So it seems like the abandonment of caring for the people of your nation, of your society, has had no positive impact whatsoever on that society, other than on some sort of paper document that we're just supposed to take as being purportedly in favor of the general welfare. And yet there was a time when our country wasn't poor and wasn't in debt, and we had these services, and they weren't a bad thing. So I think libertarianism is wrong for a lot of reasons, and I think that
anarcho-libertarians are fucking hilarious to me.
Well, what's funny? In the 19th century, there was no such thing as libertarianism yet, because liberalism meant something different, and they had the same people, and they were called anarcho-liberals. And so I always get anarcho-libertarians and anarcho-liberals confused, and I never understood why there's two words for the same thing. But yeah, I mean, it's just, if the people come together and they choose to do something using the tool of the government, then there's no reason why it shouldn't be enacted, because that's literally what the government's supposed to do. And it's not, I don't know, I feel like calling yourself a conservative who is against the legitimacy of the people to enact what they want is inherently a flawed statement. Like, the conservatives in Britain still to this day support the NHS, and I don't think that I would be against that even if I lived in that country, because there's nothing inherently wrong with the system so much as there is something wrong with the things outside of the system. And a lot of it has to do with the way that it's run and who it is that's benefiting and that kind of thing. But
I think libertarianism is it has limited effectiveness, because it would work in a society that has a really high social capital and really high trust neighborhoods. Like,
well, my main problem,
but because like people have like, there's a large population in any society that has poor impulse control, and either you can rein in this impulse, this poor impulse control by instituting like government regulations saying, you can't take drugs to get high, you can't gamble. You can't do like lascivious sexual acts in public. Things like this. Either you have government laws in place that forbid people from doing this, or you have social social regulations between neighbors within a community that prevent people from doing this. And in the present time, we don't have this high trust society that dissuades people from engaging in high impulse behaviors. So you kind of need the government to step in and prevent people from doing this.
And I guess my main complaint about libertarianism in its modern sense is the fact that they say we need to take power away from the government and give it back to the corporations because they run more efficiently. But then you ask them, what is it about the government that is inefficient? And they say, oh, the bureaucracy. It takes too long. There's too many people in these positions making decisions. You don't have any effect over that.
It's the corporations that made those bureaucracies.
Exactly. And then on the other side, the private sector has the exact same problem where all of the major corporations have these vast swelling managerial classes that completely choke out the lower ends of their production to the fact where they need to literally employ slave labor in places like India and China. And so you're just saying we need to shift power from this group of bureaucrats to this group of bureaucrats, when in reality they're both the same thing, and that's going to end up with nothing. And you have no recourse over the companies, whereas you have some recourse over the government. So you're taking power away from yourself for something that isn't true. And I just think that it's a fundamentally flawed.
It also comes from this idea that we could live in a world without a state. I generally don't believe that. I believe we do need like the state now and forever. It would just change over time with the coming tides.
Well, there's nothing wrong with the state.
Exactly.
The problem with the state is when it no longer represents the people, which are supposed to give it legitimacy, and it in turn has legitimacy in and of itself. If the state is a tool of the people, then what exactly is supposed to be the problem? Like, seeing it as an adversary can only be true when it exists as an adversary. And, if you were living 300 years ago when you had a king and you had no constitution and he said something and, his word was law, then I could get that. But living in a society where they're supposed to represent you and they're supposed to uphold your beliefs and saying that that's a bad thing and that these other people should be in charge, even though they don't actually have any recourse to you, it just seems like a bizarre catch-22, but this was a side rant.
Well, I mean, getting back to the opioid crisis, I said in a recent video that the power of politicians comes from, like, the legitimacy of the power of politicians come from the consent of the governed. Once people decide that they are no longer represented by their politicians, then they tend to be overthrown, as we've seen many times throughout history. And because our current politicians likely know that they do not represent our interests, it may present somewhat of an incentive for them to push for pharmaceutical companies like Purdue to push these drugs on subjects, because they know it puts them in a complacent position. It puts them in a zoned out, dopey state where they can't really hold the government to account for its misdoings.
Right.
So,
and that's another interesting point is why would we elect politicians that hate us? And the only answer can be because we hate ourselves. And that seems to also go back to the topic of the opioids. Why would we continuously take a drug that zones us out and disconnects us from reality? Because we hate that reality or we can't stand it. And so this dis-ease with reality and with accepting our own existence seems to be a root of a lot of the ills in society itself.
That's a very nihilistic view, my dude.
That's not nihilistic. I mean, because once we can understand why it is that we've come to hate ourselves and to put politicians into power, which reflect that deep societal feeling, then we can come to understand how we can change that view. And I mean, I personally think it's kind of obvious that we hate ourselves, especially in the West, because we constantly support these kinds of politicians. If you look
We're
at our
constantly self-flagellating ourselves.
yes, exactly. And so until we can shift this view of self-hatred, um, I don't know what else there is that we can do. And I think that that also reflects the desire of a lot of people to not to fear and to be upset by the government, because if the government is a reflection of ourselves and we don't accept ourselves and we don't accept reality, then obviously we're not going to enjoy or accept the reflection of our collective decisions. And yeah, I just think that it ties into the opioids themselves, because I think it is really an important question. Sure, it hurts and it's difficult to get off an opioid, but it also shows a fear of pain and a fear of returning to reality to stay on them, because people have been enduring pain and unpleasant situations throughout all of human history. So obviously, we didn't just
you really hit the nail on the head with this one, because look at Justin Trudeau's election back in 2015. You know, he was voted into office because he promised what? Legalization of marijuana. Into office by a mass population of people for whom reality is so unbearable that they need to smoke some kind of herb and just to escape from it. You know, they're willing to sell our country down the river a tiny little bit of pleasure from smoking weed.
Right. He was effectively saying, vote for me and we'll ignore reality together, which is a terrible political platform, but
which
it is
definitely Justin Trudeau's political platform for what I've seen so far.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think you should be writing his campaign slogans.
I don't know. Justin Trudeau, that is such an insane...
One of my friends absolutely hates him to his guts, and he lives in Canada. So every now and again, I just send him like a Justin Trudeau meme just to piss him off. It's magical. It really is. If he ever watches this, he knows who he is.
Yeah, well, try living here. Every day is like another chapter in clown world.
So, Bill C-16, huh? How's freedom of speech going over there?
Don't remind me.
That is something I've been interested in, because we're starting to get human rights councils in the United States. Like San Francisco and New York City have their own, and they have some sort of bizarre judicial power, which I feel like can't possibly be within the scope of our Constitution. But is that so? You guys have to have an executive, a legislative, and a judicial branch, right? It can't be all that different from the United States. Am I incorrect?
Yeah. Yeah, I think we do in Australia.
So, is the Human Rights Council part of the judicial branch, or is it some sort of nebulous? Like we also have the FISA courts, which is something most people don't know about, but it was it was deemed illegal for the United States to spy on U.S. citizens without a court looking over the.
So they made a court so they could look over American citizens.
Yes, and there's a lot of courts like that. Like there's a vaccine court, and if your kid takes a vaccine and something goes wrong, you're not allowed to sue them in a public court. You have to go to a vaccine court. And the FISA court exists specifically for U.S. spying situations so that nobody can know that it's happening. So are the human rights councils extrajudicial, or is it actually served by the legitimate legal judicial body?
Well, the human rights tribunals were founded by the after the Human Rights Act was passed. I think that was sometime in the late 70s. So
Red flag number one.
yeah,
Anything that was founded in the 70s a red flag, pretty much, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, they had
Yeah.
the elder Trudeau then, and he was a wrecking ball.
yeah. So a lot of what the human rights basically, what the human rights tribunals enforce are the set of human rights that are set out in the Human Rights Act and in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which was passed into law by Pierre Elliott Trudeau in 1982. And that's where a lot of this, all these like anti-free speech come from. Is the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. For instance, I think one of the last sections of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms say that all laws must be observed in a way that respects the multicultural heritage of Canada.
And this was around the time that they changed the flag.
Well, the flag was changed in 1965 by Pearson, not by Trudeau.
Oh, okay.
I would say that 1965 was the start of when Canada became a multicultural dystopia.
That's similar to the United States.
Yeah, with the Hart-Celler Act. Yeah.
Yeah, with the
It's
1965 Immigration Act.
It's almost like there was a concerted effort in the West at that time.
It's almost like these aren't all just coincidences.
What, are you saying that there's a massive conspiracy to push this ideology?
I
didn't know you were wearing the tinfoil hat.
I don't know that I would say that it's
Hey,
well.
take those. You've been wearing those glasses from They Live, haven't you?
Conspiracy is a word that I don't think a lot of people understand.
I agree.
I would say that the French Revolution was a conspiracy, not in that there was a select group of people that pushed it to occur and to kill the aristocracy and to remove the old order, as much as there was a new idea and there were people that were breathing in this new idea. And as I said on one of our other streams, conspire is Greek and it literally means breathe together. And I think that in 1965, well, it was a very interesting time in the West.
Oh, yeah, that's
Yeah.
for sure.
And there were a lot of extremely gangsterist type of people that were formated in the in separate countries. Like in our country, Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton were coming to be in their own. And around that time, Hillary Clinton was getting into politics, and I don't know. There's a lot of things that are just incredibly ridiculous about that character in particular, but that was with the death of the American Communist Party, and there was a sort of new undercurrent where people were looking to. There was the FBI actually made a new classification in the mid '60s for terrorist organizations, and they were called apocalyptic terrorists. And the apocalyptic this is real. This is from. I'm not even making this up. It sounds insane. The apocalyptic terrorists believed that if they brought enough disorder to society, that they could bring the end of the country.
So the Weathermen.
Yes, the Weathermen were considered apocalyptic terrorists. And so I would say it was a conspiracy in the sense that there was new ideas which were being used by people who thought it was politically expedient to ratchet for what they believed in. But, you know, I'm not huge on cabals, I guess you could say. But I do believe in cartels, but that's a whole other conversation.
Well, yeah, I agree. The word conspiracy has been so demonized in the mainstream. Conspiracies never happen is ludicrous. I mean, groups conspire amongst themselves all the time. I mean, people on our side achieve our aims, and it would be laughable to suggest that the people in power, you know, the powers that be, that they don't conspire to achieve their aims. And I'm sure that their conspiracies are much more potent than ours and more far-reaching.
Very much. When it comes to conspiracy theories, it's a very simple litmus test of whether or not it's true, and it's how much fact and truth can you be able to gleam over it without it just being nuggets? Because if you look at a lot of like the insane conspiracy theories, they always have like one little nugget of truth, but they only expand on that nugget of truth and nothing else.
Well, I don't know about always. Like the one conspiracy I always go back to as the pinnacle of what people believe is a conspiracy theory today is that man never went to the moon, and that NASA is a fake corporation that is tricking the entire world or whatever. Like that's the kind of conspiracy that could never happen because that would require every nation on Earth working together. And
it would require so much fucking effort.
It would require
more effort to get a man to the fucking moon.
It would require the USSR and NATO working together to promote an idea that doesn't matter. And
that kind of falls apart because the USSR and NATO working together.
Yeah, they really didn't like each other for various reasons, but which is actually kind of interesting because the USSR really wasn't that different from China today, and we get along great with them. But
slave labor is a very good business transaction, Avi.
I think that has to
do
with
because they provide us with so much cheap crap.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, which is just great, right? Like, don't you
Production
enjoy
powerhouses.
having to buy the same thing every year and making no money whatsoever?
The problem is that like the country will eventually crash, and oh boy, is it going to crash hard.
I don't know, because there's an assumption that Western people take that humans want to be free. And the idea of freedom and self-determination and individualism in the Western context is something that our most intelligent people struggled with for 700-800 years. And it's something that is ingrained in our culture through a lot of constructs and a lot of the way our societies work, and even really small things like juries. That was something that came out of the Renaissance in Europe in the 12th and 13th centuries. And it was such a staggering innovation over the way that law had been previously given. And it's something that people today really don't recognize as the tool of legitimacy, which it is. And the assumption that a group of people, like the people in China, would not want to have a despotic government when they've never experienced anything else in their thousands of years of existing. I don't want to sound overly negative, but it wouldn't surprise me if, even if the CCP did collapse, if a similar organization didn't take over, because you can't just teach people something that it took your people to learn over hundreds of years in a couple of decades. And that's been proven again and again and again in Algeria, in Israel, in India, in Libya, in Syria, in Iraq, and in so many other places, that just because something is a good and a workable idea, and just because it is the pinnacle of our experience, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's something that can be taught immediately. And it certainly doesn't mean that it's something that's endemic to existence.
Vlad, you gonna add anything to that?
just my 2 cents.
Well, I mean, I was just thinking about where to take this, because I don't like I want to make this stream too normie unfriendly, but I think that
too normie unfriendly.
a major determining factor of the government that runs a country is at some level genetics. There's that famous quote that demographics is destiny, and I think that that the government of a people is largely determined by genetic factors that, as you alluded to, have been shaped by history over years. But if you look at China, China has never produced pretty much anything close to a democratic republic or anything like we have in the West. It's pretty much just been ruled by dictators and bloodthirsty despots through its past history of 40 centuries.
Yeah.
So I think at some level you have to ascribe their condition to their genetics.
And sure, you could call it genetics, or you could call it society, or you could call it memetics, which is a word that's been totally bastardized. But
Medics.
it's not, regardless of what you want to call it, it's not something that can happen immediately. And to expect for other people to uphold values which they did not discover for themselves and have never come into contact with has been proven repeatedly to be a failure of an idea. And I mean, so before World War II, it was assumed, especially by the German command, that if they could bomb the shit out of Britain, that the people would go insane and the people would not be able to uphold the war effort because there would be bombs dropping everywhere and everything would be destroyed, and they would just go into a frenzy. And this was the theory of air superiority leading into World War II. And the Germans did this in London, and other countries did this all throughout the war, where they thought that they could destroy the will of the people of the country by bombing them. And it didn't end up working, and they came up with this term of the near miss. And the near miss was where if you got hit by a bomb, you would be terrified, and you would either be dead or you would be completely demoralized. But if you didn't, you would be emboldened. And the people of England were emboldened to continue on the war, even as they were bombed and even as the various sectors of their cities were destroyed. And they quickly discovered that in republics, in places where the people felt like the government was theirs as opposed to something that controlled them, that they had a resiliency in warfare that went far beyond what despotic governments could muster. Because if you didn't feel like the government had any relation to you other than owning you, then you felt much less compelled to defend them and to defend what you saw as your country. And so it was seen as a point of resilience that democratic nations would be able to go to further lengths in warfare. But the thing is,
you basically become more patriotic in a sense, right? Because you do believe in the ideals of the country you're fighting for.
Right, but it also opens up a new avenue of warfare, where if the people of a country are the ones who empower the government, then you don't need to conquer the government. All you need to do is either get the people to believe in something that aligns with what you believe in and to make that the structures of the government, or to replace them. And this was actually a tactic that Turkey used with Greece and with Armenia and with several other countries, where they made deals with them to return their people to their country, and then they killed those people, and then they sent Turkish people over. And this was an attempt to...
Sorry, continue.
No, I was just going to say this was an attempt to wage a sort of Republican warfare, if you will, where you don't need to control the government if your people can do that. And so it does need to be recognized that Republican forms of government have somewhat made old forms of war obsolete, where you do not need to conquer the opposing government. You simply need to either conquer the opposing population's ideas or replace them in such a fashion where their ideas are your ideas, however that happens. And I mean,
kind of reminds me of when I was reading and watching on Roman history, and like during like the Republic days, I'm not sure about the Empire days. Basically, when they went to each city or town, they would basically start putting in Roman ideas and stuff like that into it, and basically making the citizenry want to join the Legionnaires.
Yes. Yeah. Romanization.
Romanization, yeah.
And in America, we had Americanization, where when people would come over here, they'd get new names, they'd learn a new language, they wouldn't teach their kids their old language, and over a couple of generations, they would become Americanized.
But then in the '60s, basically everyone started hating America for
Yeah,
what every other country has done before.
and it was determined that Americanization was no longer necessary, and the dissolution of Americanization has led to a state where, um, I mean, demographics was never as big of an issue in the United States back when people wanted to be American. It was more that you were appealing to their ideas. And it's interesting because Socrates said intelligent men talk about ideas, middling men talk about settings, and bottom men talk about people. And even though we declare ourselves the most intelligent generation and that we are, more intelligent than any of the people that came before us at another point in time 100 years ago, our nations were talking about ideas at the level of the citizenry. And today we talk about people. And Socrates was a pretty smart guy. So I think that he had something to say about that.
I mean, he did basically make debate as it is today in the West. So I think very smart lad.
He did a lot of things. He was a huge proponent of democracy itself, and
I want to read up more on him. Definitely,
it's tough
because
because
you guys were describing and how a country how you conquer your enemy by making him accept your ideals rather than using military force is what the left has understood, or since the early 1900s, with Antonio Gramsci, because initially the objective of the Comintern after the Bolshevik Revolution was to create a worldwide communism by inciting violent revolutions across all these European countries. The workers would just rise up and overthrow the government. But of course,
that's what the idea of Trotsky's world communism was: is basically have the revolution go on across the world.
Yeah, but obviously this didn't happen. So instead, they advocated for the long march through the institutions, where they would slowly inject their ideas into academia and into various levels of the government, and eventually that would permeate down to the public.
And we're kind of seeing the end result of that, in a sense, if you think about it.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's what I think that's what partly what we're doing right now with this new right movement. Permeating our ideas into various levels of the government, and that's why the left has been so successful 60 or 70 years in propagating their ideas.
Well, I'm very much a center left person, classical liberal basically, and honestly, like it took us by surprise just how much of this bullshit just came about. Like a lot of people who are like left but moderate and don't believe in these crazy ideas are basically just disenfranchised, really. Like basically we're just kind of wandering and we're just finding like another group to go to, either it's like the skeptics or the alt-right or whatever. It's kind of really disheartening.
Yeah, and I mean, that was a principle that Hitler brought up, and that I think it was Goring that was with him that said it, that the petit bourgeois will never become a national socialist, but the communist always will. And it's the sense that ideologies are necessarily interchangeable, because an ideology is in and of itself an escape from reality. And I would hesitate to say that going for the same method of obtaining control is a dangerous one, because one, we have new tools and we have new ways of propagating our ideas, which we are doing, and I'm not trying to say anything against that, but the hard left that is in control right now did go through the institutions, and they did go through the means of control. And by doing that, I think that they lost something of themselves, and they surrendered themselves to
they surrendered themselves to power.
Right, exactly. And I think that parroting that would necessarily water down what it is that we're trying to do to begin with. And I think that the next effective movement has to focus on moving the society from without rather than within, because moving from without is something that hasn't happened in a long time. And when people get to the point where they no longer accept the legitimacy of the power of the system which they feel doesn't represent them in the first place, then saying we're going to restore legitimacy through that same system is necessarily going to disappeal to people. Yeah, no,
Mm.
I try not to put a label on myself because
Fair
I
enough.
guess a lot of the things that I think about I don't consider political, but my main concern is the reality of man and the picture of a person to themselves, and why it is that that's such a difficult concept to wrestle with to begin with, because this is the first time in human history that you could say that. And certainly a good chunk of it is the fact that the people that are supposed to relate the concepts of reality to the average person are these people in these institutions, which are pushing these ideologies. And they are so disconnected from the average person that there's no
Oh,
way for them to communicate an idea to
and
the
you can
average
tell.
person.
You can tell that they're completely disconnected. Like if you look at like all the resistance against it, like I'll use the skeptic community because that's probably the biggest example I can think of. If you look at them, the academics only really came later. Most of them are like working class Joes. I'll probably be able to have a beer with them probably one day if I think about it. Like, but with any like social justice warrior or like anyone from the colleges, I can't sit down and have a beer with them. I can't have a casual conversation with them. Like they're so completely disconnected. Like they don't know who they're talking about, or even I don't even believe like they know who they're talking on behalf of.
Right. And, you know, especially with modern philosophy, it's really disgusting what has happened to philosophy in the past couple of years, because
Right.
philosophy was supposed to be how to attain the good life. And the good life is something that the average person should be concerned with. And
And now it's
if you
condemn everyone for
read,
having a good life.
right, if you read a modern philosopher's work, you can't understand it. And they come to these conclusions which seem completely outside of reality. And in what sense can a person be accomplishing the task of relating reality to the average person when they can't even hold a conversation with them? It's just, we've been completely failed by our intellectuals and our elites. And that failing has been the direct result of them not caring about the people that they're supposed to be serving and caring specifically about serving their ideology. And I guess
If you
just the
think of
point that I'm trying to get to is that doing something similar to that will have the same result.
if you think about it, the people that they talk of, like, you know, always their ideology is in defense of someone else. It's never in defense of themselves or their ideas. If you think about it, the people that they talk about defending, they basically see them as children. And it's really
Right.
condescending. Like it basically like they need to be protected. They need to like have certain words not be said. They need to basically be validated. They need to be given candy or whatever. They should not be punished. Like they basically get treated like children almost.
There is an extreme tendency towards condescension and
Yeah.
towards the rejection of agency,
Oh
especially
yeah.
in the powerful far left movements, where, you know, it's not that a woman can't go and make something of herself, it's that it's someone else's fault. It's not that a minority can't integrate into a society, it's that we've set up some kind of structure to prevent them from doing that. And it's extremely dismissive, and it also um, neglects the question of why isn't this working, because it gives you this short sort of soundbitey kind of answer to something which is infinitely more complex. And there's also the problem of the people that are in charge of society genuinely believing that the average person can't handle a complex idea. I mean,
Which is retarded. It's retarded. Like,
Right,
it
like
would take a while for it to explain a complex idea, but they'll eventually get it. I genuinely believe the vast majority of people can get a complex idea.
I'll give one example here. I was in I worked in colleges. I ran college bookstores, and
Also,
I had one, and I can't get too much into it, but I had an event happen where someone from the school newspaper came to talk to me, and we had a nice interview, and I had the questions written down, and I had my responses written down, and she left, and it seemed like a nice event. And
right.
the next day, I checked the newspaper, and she had written a slander piece about me. And she had quotes from me, which were things that I had not said because I had my responses written down. So I knew specifically what it was that I had said. And I get a call from the VP, the vice president of finance at the school. And she said she needs to talk to me. And I come up and I bring the paper, and she says, "Why did you say these things? What happened?" And I was like, "Okay, so I didn't say these things, and I have my responses written down." And we went through it, and she was like, "Oh, okay, well, it's just a misunderstanding." And I was like, I just want to point out that this isn't a misunderstanding. This is slander. Like, this student of journalism who was about to graduate and who was in charge of reporting for this prestigious school newspaper had completely slandered a business which was working on their behalf. And she looked at me and she said, "Oh, well, they're just kids." And I was like,
No, they're adults. They're fucking adults. I'm sick of this fucking excuse. No, college students are fucking adults. They can
Well-
take a fucking idea. They're meant to be fucking adults. They're drinking for Christ's sake, partying to bed, having casual sex. Fuck off. They're not
And
children. They're supposed
this
to
wasn't-
take fucking responsibility.
yeah,
Sorry, I
this
got really-
wasn't a freshman. This was at least a 21-year-old person. And I
And
said,
now she works for the New York Times.
that's exactly what my point was. My point to the administrator was, look, I'm okay with the fact that she slandered me because, it doesn't matter. This isn't a real newspaper. It has a circulation of 30. But this is someone with a journalism degree soon. And this is someone who's going to be going into this field. And they don't understand that you can't lie about interviews that you have. And that's not a good lesson for someone who's going out into society and who is going to be a professional. And she was just like, "Oh, and that's kind of where it was left." And again, this was an administrator. This was the VP of finance for this college. And this is the view that they took of the people going to their school. Not, this is the future. This is the next generation of reporters and mathematicians and scientists. But these are children, and you can't blame them for their actions.
Do you guys remember that story from the Rolling Stone a few years ago? I think it was called "Rape on Campus," where it was
I remember that
big hit piece about the University of Virginia and how this woman was raped, and that the school administrators didn't believe her story. And then it turned the university received a massive backlash about this, and then eventually it turned out that the whole story was fake. Like, it was just made up from whole cloth.
And this is something that's being fostered in these schools,
Yeah, nobody cares.
It's encouraged. It's downright encouraged. It's even like getting into like stats and studies. Like you've guys heard of the 1 in 4 stat that 1 in 4 women get raped on college campuses.
Right.
So that stat is incredibly faulty for several reasons. First off, when it comes to the questionnaire, basically, if I remember correctly, 3 of the 4 responses, because this is multiple choice, are basically negative actions. And every single negative thing that is purported on there is counted towards sexual assault and rape. So basically, they basically put it up, right? Second off, when actually contacted about the study, it turned out that it's basically the study was completely falsified. They actually redid it. The study, the closest number they got with the same criteria and the same methods, they managed to get 1 in 14. It's ridiculous.
And it's really strange because
sorry, let me just make a quick point. Basically, sexual harassment in today's culture means unwanted male attention.
Yeah, exactly. They've basically changed it to the male gaze. It's also that is a wing of feminism mainly sex negative feminism, where basically like the male gaze is pretty much just as bad as sexual harassment.
Sex negative feminism.
Yeah, it's a thing. It's very Puritan. It's basically the Anita Sarkeesians and bell hooks of feminism.
I and sex is a perfectly natural thing that people do because it's necessary, and it just seems like another
I don't
uh
understand why the shame's there.
yeah,
Like,
there's a French term, and it's Vlad will probably know it. Au revoir, I think it is, and that's against the grain, and it's a term referencing um going against the nature of something, and it's seen as well, I mean, it was seen as negative. I guess the book I'm pulling from is pretty old. I don't know how the Frenchmen are doing these days, but I did hear that they had 1,000 cars set on fire on New Year's Eve.
cars apiece. Cars apiece.
Cars.
Yeah, I'm sure those cars were set alight by patriotic Frenchmen.
They were waving baguettes in their striped sweaters.
Look. You see, the thing is that those flaming cars are cultural appropriation because that's a tradition in the Middle East. I'll have you know. So in reality, the French are racist.
It's sad, man. Like,
yeah, we're living
when
a
you see
weird time,
pictures
man.
of Paris from 100 years ago, and you're like, oh, I'd like to go there. And then I was in Paris not too long ago, and I saw a broken-legged Romani woman, and her legs were like this, and she walked down the street like this, and I was so confused. And I was in a student ambassador program, and I was with an MEP from England, and he was like, if you see children, get away from them because they distract you and take your wallet. And I was like, holy fuck, dude, like, Paris is worse than Detroit.
Jesus Christ.
This was in 2007, 2008.
People complain about Chicago. Jesus Christ.
Well, Chicago is a shithole.
Yeah.
I think that they found that there was a slave workshop somewhere in Chicago like 3 or 4 years ago. The city council of Chicago has actually asked UN peacekeepers to come in recently. And UN peacekeepers have a nasty habit of raping and pillaging the places where they are, and yet for some reason I think Chicago would probably still be better off after that. Oh, sorry.
Let it run.
They turned all of Chicago into an exclave of Zimbabwe.
I don't know. I don't know what you do. I mean, in China,
Can't really do anything. Really.
in China, when they have large cities that are failing, they enact what are called economic exclusionary zones. And they set up a zone where taxes are not collected if you live within a certain area. And they try to do that to incentivize businesses to move to that area and to renovate it and to increase the economic output to the point where the people can sustain themselves, which I think is kind of an interesting idea. And the only problem is I don't know if... Yeah, well, the industrial sectors of Chicago have been so torn down and neglected that I'm not sure that anyone could actually move in there and do anything about it. But I don't know what you do about like New York City. New York City, there are docks and there are manufacturing areas, and all the places that used to be productive and useful are gone, and it's just apartment buildings and restaurants and bars. And I don't know what you do to revitalize an area like that when all you can do is introduce a service sector economy, you know? And the service sector economy is another really interesting aspect of our society because this is probably the first time in a couple hundred years where people intentionally put themselves in a position to be a servant, which historically was seen as, basically slave work. And the service sector jobs are almost mirror reflections of bureaucratic and managerial jobs in the sense that they don't actually produce anything which is useful. And so it's kind of interesting that the people that gutted our society and removed all the potential for the average person put in a system of work for them which reflects what it is that they do in the first place. But
yeah, and another point to make about the transition to a service sector is that customer service work, like sales or just being a cashier or jobs like that, they incentivize a certain type of mentality that goes very much against the traditional male mindset. Like the types of people who tend to thrive in service sector jobs are either women or very emasculated men.
subservience.
Yeah, exactly. Like it definitely discourages traditional male attributes, like assertiveness and like being.
That's definitely another topic that is very like of contention nowadays of what is masculinity. It's kind of sad.
Going back to the opiate thing, like it's no surprise that so many people are just going like turning away from the economy in general and just staying indoors, becoming neats as they say, and just taking drugs all day.
You mean LARPing revolutionaries?
Yeah, there's no like viable economic engagement for these people.
Yeah, just sitting down, growing fat, playing video games.
I just think that it's interesting that the foot soldiers of the far left, who within recent memory of a lot of people that are alive to this day, not any of us, but our parents and grandparents, they wanted fair working conditions and they wanted dignity for the working people, and they wanted more equally distributed society. And today they are neats and they're out in their black outfits punching people in the face for whatever reason. And what they're fighting for is more centralization and more power to the people that already have power in the hopes of this.
They'll get taken care of.
Yes, the left coined the term trickle down economics. And trickle down economics is where you make it so that the mega corporations do so well that hopefully some of it spills over down to the people at the bottom, right? Which is not something that's necessarily ever been a platform of the people on the right, but it's been sort of a smear in the same sense that capitalism was never a word that existed before Marx, and he used it as a smear against certain kinds of societies. And so they came up with this idea of trickle down economics and how it was evil. And then today they say that we need a universal basic income. And the universal basic income is where we give so much authority and power to these mega corporations that they can produce enough to also write you a check. So you get your check from the Amazon corporation, which you use to go and buy Amazon products to enable them to continue to expand. And it's
almost like they're advocating for a kind of indentured servitude where the master he lets you live on his property and he gives you tokens to buy his bread, but you have to do all the work for him.
It is exactly indentured servitude. Yeah. It's a new form of serfdom where instead of being a property of the land, you're a property of the local company. And they give you a check to continue to farm for, cheap, shitty Chinese products. And there's no dignity in it. And, maybe you get your UBI and you also go and you make your coffees at Starbucks so that the CEO can come in and have someone treat him like he's a king. But it's just so
as long as they make new Star Wars movies, these people are never going to advocate for any kind of social change.
Right, and yet they couch it in a way of advocating for social change, but the social change that they advocate for is inherently, I would say inherently ultra conservative in the sense of returning to a servant based society overall, and it's really strange to me that they spent all of this time to attempt to infiltrate a system, to dominate it, and to bring it to what they thought was going to be a good end. And yet, in the end, all that they came up with was an aristocratic system with serfdom. Well, yeah, I mean,
Well, to them, it's not aristocratic. It's just them fighting the good fight, so to speak. But it's completely aristocratic. It's just, yeah, fucking hell.
I know.
well, it's
I would
interesting.
argue that what you've just described is like the logical conclusion of egalitarianism. Like everybody's just, it's a system whereby everybody's reduced to the lowest common denominator, and everybody's just a serf working for the government, and nobody's greater than anybody else because everybody receives the same guaranteed minimum wage, and nobody can rise above anybody else. It's a very egalitarian world that they're.
Well, there's also the
advocating.
idea of, there's also the fact that it's kind of like a jealousy for success, which I never really understood. Like, I'm very much of like the opinion that if you work hard enough at something, you can basically achieve anything, right? I do believe in the power of the human spirit, but there is like a push that if someone gains success, it obviously must be stolen,
Right.
without ever looking into the person's past or what they did.
And I mean, it's kind of, it's hard at this point because our society and our structures of power are sort of set up off of disenfranchising and robbing people. And so if you simply play the game and you do it well, you do rise because of your own ability, but at the same time, you do also tend to rise to a position of manipulation. And so if you come to, be the next Steve Jobs, and you did that yourself, you worked hard, you got all the way up, and you made some sort of computer empire. Your computers aren't being made in your country. They're not being manufactured. The research isn't going on. The developers aren't from there. And so, in a sense, you are taking what was given to you by your country and leveraging it against those very people in order to make money off of them. And so I think it's sort of a paradox of the modern society that you can rise of your own volition, but you also necessarily will be robbing the people around you. And it hasn't historically been that it's so zero sum, like Edison and Ford, and they did contribute a lot of negative things, which I could get into, but I won't at this time because at the end of the day, they did enrich the people which also consumed their products, and that doesn't exist anymore.
I think like that's just I think that's more to do with the nature of power rather than like the nature of like success, I guess.
I think it would be different. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier. Why are companies offshoring? Well, they offshore because they say it's cheaper. Well, why is it cheaper? It's cheaper because they don't have to pay people as much. So why is it that when companies were paying people more, they had more wealth? And that's sort of the question that goes unanswered. And the answer seems to be because if you are creating and generating wealth within your own nation, then it's going to the people which are necessary, which are consuming the product and which are using it overall. And when you have an open globalist system, which we do, which I am 100% against globalization. That is definitely one of the things that I fall into with the alt-right. Not necessarily, not...
I'm against it because it only really benefits businesses and it only really applies to businesses. It doesn't really apply to anyone else in the world.
I would argue that it doesn't even benefit the businesses because businesses are not doing as well today as they were doing in 1950, 1960, 1970. Their debt ratios are much higher. They need bailouts from the government. They need to employ this slave labor in these countries to survive and to persist. And on paper, they're doing better, but what is a business? A business isn't an abstract idea. A business is a group of people coming together to produce something. And when an appreciable chunk of those people are in horror conditions, in what sense are they doing better?
I think there is definitely a disconnect between, like, say, a massive CEO and the employees under him. While with a smaller and mid-range business, like, because of the fact you have to interact with the employees, you just naturally humanize them.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of factors leading into it, and I think all of this does directly have to do with the opioid epidemic.
Yeah, we forgot to talk about that subject.
Well, I think that a lot of our major problems are underpinned by larger philosophical problems. And especially, I mean, opioids for sure, but I think that there's an even larger problem with, as Vlad said, things like benzodiazepines. And a year after the chemical serotonin was discovered, literally within 12 months, pharmaceutical companies had a drug that would manipulate its release in the mind. And this was supposed to have a direct effect on depression. And this is where a lot of these depression drugs come from. So, within the discovery of a chemical in the brain, within 12 months, these people had decided that by manipulating this, they could affect the way that a person is and exists. And that's a much bigger question than simply this chemical exists. If we manipulate it, you'll be better. Because why is that true? And at what point in history has someone ever been sad and gotten better? And was it because they took a drug, or was it because maybe there's something more to it? And so there's a lot of really big questions to ask, especially around drugs and their use and their distribution, that isn't a conversation that's going on.
Yeah, and there's the problem that you touched on earlier, and that's the problem of existential emptiness. It's just like people need to have some kind of identity. They have to strive for some sort of for some sort of objective in life.
I
You know,
I think
beyond
I
wasting
think
away. They have to have something to occupy their minds with. And when you have a culture that's just completely void of any artistic credibility, when you have an economy that doesn't reward uh, traditional values, that promotes just being some kind of glorified salesman, when you have you know an academic system that teaches young people that they're worthless and that they don't deserve what they have and they need to sacrifice everything for people who are lower than them, it just accumulates into this massive existential emptiness where people just they don't know what they're supposed to be in life, and
I
that
think
void is filled by pharmaceuticals.
I think we, as a society in the West, we're hitting headlong into the idea of the absurd, where humans are screaming out into the void in the universe for meaning, and the universe replies in silence.
Well,
And it's a very deafening silence we're experiencing right now, to say the least.
that's a problem that's been afflicting the human race for the last 400 years. Well, Western people, for the last 400 years. And it's an interesting question because it all hinges on one belief. And when something happens, we tend to believe that there's a cause. You know, if a book falls off your
Oh,
bookshelf,
yeah.
you're going to try and figure out why. If you
Humans
get
are
fired,
hardwired like that.
right? And it's a perfectly natural tendency, and it's something that people do. And the only thing that you're not allowed to attribute a cause to is the creation of the universe itself. It just is. And this is completely counter to what humans are, and it's au revoir. It's against the grain. It's against nature. And so by pulling out the bottom rung of the way that we think, because our intellectuals tell us this is the way it is, and we say, why is it that it starts at the Big Bang, and why is it that that's the starting point? And they say it is because it is. This leaves dissonance, and this leads directly to this feature of um, existential dread, whatever you want to call it,
There's
because
probably a technical word for it, but I have to read more Nietzsche and Camus to understand it.
right, if you want to get into that, you need to start with Leibniz, because Leibniz and what's his name, Descartes, were the first two to actually talk about it, and Pascal for sure. Yeah. But Pascal,
I want to get into the subject of existentialism and absurdism. It sounds really interesting to me.
I have a really fantastic author who might have been the last actual American philosopher.
If you say Foucault, I'm going to be really annoyed.
No, I'm actually reading this book right now, Death of the Soul, William Barrett. I have another book by him that's specifically on existentialism, but that's literally what he talks about in this book. The death of the soul allowed for the void, which is frequently referred to by people. You got to fill that void in your life. You have to fill it with sex, with drugs, with something consumable, which can be used to... Yes.
Basically, you have to fill it with distraction.
Well, you have to fill it with something consumable, which drives the economy, which makes these companies continue to have larger profits, which makes people able to be enticed into situations. And ideologies, products, materialism, all these different kinds of things are all direct results of people being at dis-ease with themselves and with their existence, because the questions that we have as people can't be answered. And, you can get a more complex explanation as to why everything is absurd, but the whole question of absurdity arises from the fact that the way that we think is incompatible with what we're told is real. And
it's noteworthy. Oh, sorry.
No, go for it.
Well, I was just going to say, it's noteworthy that anything that you identify with that is not a consumable product is considered politically incorrect. It's good to say, like, oh, I'm a Chevy guy, or I'm a Ford guy, or I love the New England Patriots. Like, if you identify with these things, then that's totally fine. But as soon as you say, oh, I'm a Canadian, or I'm white, then that's bad, because that's not something that can be sold. It's not a consumable product.
Right. Also, there's the level of there's also like a taboo against being a patriot.
And these are the last couple of things that we have to discard, because there were other things that people could cling to before we had to get to this point. You could say, I'm an artist, I'm an artisan, I'm a craftsman, I'm a pillar of my society, I'm a creator, things like this. And those have all been stripped of us, because those were the people who led the revolutions that created the new world in the 19th century. And it was necessary to strip them from society because they had the power to alter reality. And that is another... the stripping of these people from society led directly to our service economies and to our service lifestyles, where you are replaceable because you don't do anything in particular which is necessary. And when we were stripped of these identities, and I mean, if I've lost a job that I took very seriously before, and the immediate removal of that felt very similar to the removal of my identity. And I saw myself as disposable. And I think that that's the current state of our society. Whereas in 1830, if you were a glassmaker and you couldn't work at your factory anymore, or you couldn't go to this large organization or anything like that, you could still go home and you would still be a glassmaker, and you still had the ability to contribute to your society something that was useful and that they needed. And even without the confines of the work environment which you had, you were still capable of generating value, which couldn't be taken away from you. But today, if you are taken directly out of your work environment through firing, through layoff, through anything like that, you are removed of your ability to have a productive capacity. And I think that that was sort of the end goal. And that's similar to what we're seeing now, where people are being stripped of their public credentials in an attempt to dismiss them from being people to begin with.
Yeah, that's definitely very true. Like, I think that's maybe one of the reasons why, like, so many people, whenever like there's a massive controversy, or like someone says something of the wrong thing, their livelihoods are what get attacked rather than their character.
And their livelihoods can only get attacked because your livelihood is no longer dependent on who you are.
Yeah.
And that's why the last bastion that we have is to fall back on nationalism and race and social organization and that kind of thing, because there's no other way that we can define ourselves, because the ability to define ourselves has been stripped so bare. And if we allow...
This is what happens when you just unwillingly just deconstruct everything and just make it a negative conclusion all the time. I'm talking to the postmodernist here. Just because you deconstruct stuff doesn't make you smart. You have to have a conclusion.
It doesn't make it unnecessary either.
Yeah. Like I love deconstructing like art and stuff, but it's normally done out of like a labor of love rather than just like, this is sexist, this is racist or whatever. It's like, no, you're not adding anything to the world. You're just taking it away because you feel vindictive. That's it.
Yeah, and the whole argument of... Go ahead.
Sorry, deconstructionism is a spook.
A spoof?
Well, there's the common reference to Max Stirner, who was like a Marxist, communist philosopher in the 19th century. He said that political ideals like, nationalism, patriotism, these were what are called spooks, which are basically just things concocted by the human mind. And it's a common meme among leftists to say that whiteness is a spook, or religion is a spook, because it's a ghost. It doesn't exist. So yeah, I like to say that leftism is a spook, Marxism is a spook. They never apply logic to their own side.
I find it really funny that the ones that talk about narratives so much, that all narratives are mainly just false, except for their narrative, which is basically the Marxist lens.
Yeah. These people never deconstruct Marxism. I wonder why.
No, they never do. It's because it's because of something they believe. If they can easily deconstruct something that they don't believe, and they've been told that it's evil to a certain degree, but they can never deconstruct their own beliefs. It's the reason why they're so defensive when you actually start questioning them about it.
Yeah, communism kind of deconstructed itself with the dissolution of the USSR. So why deconstruct something that's already been deconstructed, I suppose?
But it hasn't really been deconstructed by the Marxists themselves, because they managed to survive.
Right. Yeah, I would honestly say that most people that are socialist and far left today are not Marxists, because they're all bourgeois, well-off. They're all the people that would have been killed by the Marxists. And it's actually, I think it's really fascinating.
It's really funny.
I think it's fascinating.
Like, okay, who are these bourgeois fucks that you hate? My dad.
I think it's interesting though, because I think if you asked a lot of these people, do you like Marx, or do you think that Marx had something useful to say, I think they would say yes. I think they would say yes if you asked them if Stalin or if Che Guevara had something interesting to say. The system proposed by people like Che Guevara and Marx, you're right, these people would just be lined up against the wall and shot.
Yeah, I mean,
That's the thing with this ideology, is that the fact they don't really consider the moderates to be very smart, because they're dumb enough to believe that they would be in charge of the utopia.
because I hate to say it, but
Yeah.
sometimes when I read Marxist literature, especially like older stuff, I agree with a portion of it, and the portion of it that I agree with is the part that has been totally dealt away with in our society. And
Yeah.
so it just seems strange to me that like someone that declares themselves a Marxist can be for universal basic income and can be for higher business tax rates and can be for a lot of these things that keep the average person down and unable to have dignity and determine their own life, when those kinds of things were the very things that Marx was actually speaking about.
When it comes to pretty much socialism as a whole, especially on the left, it's very much it's almost up to the person's own personal interpretation, because they basically put all their utopian ideas into the word socialist or the word Marxist. It's very much an emotional thing, rather than basically them sitting down, reading Das Kapital, reading Conquest of Bread, and actually coming to those ideas themselves through philosophy.
Well, I mean, those are long books.
Yeah.
I think a lot of these people,
Das Kapital
young,
apparently is
like,
masochism in a book.
yeah. Well, I mean, at this point, people like Marx and Lenin, and they've become more like symbols rather than actual philosophers or men who actually lived. Because you get these young communists in particular, who they're infatuated by these era statues of Marx and these depictions of Marx as some heroic figure, and so they use him as a symbol for all teenage angst and resistance against the system, when in reality they probably don't know anything about what Marx actually said.
At which point you send them you do your citizenry duty to send them the video of Karl Marx by Stefan Molyneux, and have them completely and utterly red pilled about the subject.
Yeah, that's a really good video, actually.
He was a shitty person. I mean, that's for sure.
Oh,
But
he's a piece of
it's also
shit.
kind of interesting because Karl Marx and Frederick Engels worked together, right? And Marx died, and Frederick Engels went to Prussia, and he started the Social Democratic Party at the time. And they a lot of people will bring up that in Prussia and early Germany, they had public education and they had a pension system and they had things like this, and a lot of that came from the Social Democratic Party. And Engels, after Marx died, wrote that what Marx had said had been wrong, and that a revolution wasn't necessary, and that a society could slowly progress towards a better civilization for the average person through a lifting up of them and through political action. And I think it's something that a lot of people skip over, that Marx and Engels sat there and wrote these books, but Marx died and Engels went and actually enacted a completely different system and participated in crafting something that went against what he said had to happen. And that was actually the main struggle between Karl Marx and Bakunin, was specifically how the revolution was supposed to happen and whether or not it needed to be bloody or political. And Marx always took the stand that the proletariat needed to rise up and kill everyone, because he was a very violent and angry person. And the guy he worked with died realizing quite a different system. And within the lifetime of one of the authors of Das Kapital had been proven to be out of date.
So if I start reading Das Kapital, does that mean that it basically self-flagellating myself for no reason?
It is. It's very. What would be the word? I don't want to say heavy so much as he used a lot of jingo or no,
Oh, jug.
no, wrong word. What the
Terminology.
word? Yeah, he was very much into the man. What is the word I'm thinking of? I can't believe I can't.
Why do I have a feeling that once I start reading, I'm gonna feel like I'm reading a work from Hegel?
Well, you're gonna have to have a computer next to you if you try and read Das Kapital. There's gonna be a lot of words that he uses that are only understandable in the context of the socialists who were writing at that time, and that's the annoying part. Like valorization is a word that comes up a lot, and I thought it was in reference to the word valor, but valorization means the production of excess value from a system of production. And so it's annoying to read. I will say that. But
a lot of companies will say that if you haven't read the entirety of the phenomenology of spirit and understood every word, then you can't properly debunk communism.
Phenomenology of spirit. I'll write that down as well.
Yeah, I'll just come back to the. Yeah, I'm a very much an existence-based person, and I think that there's no amount of writing words that can disprove reality. And so I would say that there's not really any need to debunk Marxism when it's a system that literally can't exist without people starving and dying and the government collapsing. So
honestly, I think the best way to debunk Marxism is just read up on basic economics, and then you can pretty much go straight from there.
Well, economics is another interesting thing because economics didn't really exist as a study until the last 100 years or so, and yet over the last 1,000 years, people have continuously become better off and more enlightened, and new ideas have arose. And so the assumption that economics is necessary for the betterment of the people seems to be a false assumption. And I guess this is one of the big problems that I have with people like Stefan Molyneux and libertarians in general, is the idea that free markets are necessary for free people, and that free markets are in and of themselves a good thing, in the sense that you could be under a dictatorship that is totalitarian, that allows for free markets, and that doesn't make the people free, and that doesn't make the advancement of I think that economics excludes the overwhelming majority of what it means for a person to be a person, and because of that, I think that it's not of highest importance. But that could just be
you can't treat the economy like some kind of golden calf that you have to serve at all costs. Like
yes,
what economics should strive to do is to improve the outcome of flesh and blood human beings, not some abstract notion of economic output or GDP per capita. You know,
right? Exactly.
A lot of people will use like GDP per capita to compare between countries, but unless you're taking into account the welfare of the average person in that country, then it's really meaningless.
I mean, economics has led companies to offshore and to destroy actual production and to destroy the means of a person attaining an identity for themselves, and to sacrifice everything upon the altar of continuously increasing profits. And that has been negative for our society overall. Our government is massively in debt. Our companies are massively in debt. Our people are massively in debt, and we have nothing to do. And
we keep bailing out those companies that are in debt with the government that is in debt.
And yet we're told that our society is richer and better off than it ever has been before. And if you only looked at the papers, then you could possibly understand. But your experience in reality should be shunned in favor of some abstract quality that's written down on a paper. And that is a great failing of our society.
Yeah. Going back to the opiate crisis for a second, like if you have like a major corporation like Purdue that's making $13 billion off the suffering of people, and everybody in that society is addicted to opiates, would you say that society is better off overall than a society that doesn't have these companies and doesn't have, $13 billion pharmaceutical industries, but where people are not
Well, they're creating $13 billion of value within your society. You should bend over and suck their dicks.
Yeah.
They're providing thousands of jobs, my dude. You need to bend over.
Yeah, I
Thousands
mean,
and the millions of
it's all deeply interrelated. And again, one of the big problems, well, something that we're told is a big problem in the West is the replacement rate of births and the infertility crisis. And instead of stepping back as leaders and saying, why is this happening? Why aren't our people having kids? Why are our people on drugs? Why are these negative things happening? They say, well, this is a problem and we need to address it. So we're going to bring in more people. And these more people that we're going to bring in are from higher fertility rate areas. And so it's going to balance out. And it's a total
It's a band-aid.
Yes, it's a band-aid, but even worse than that, it's a total dismissal of humanity as things that exist and that can be affected, and saying, like, it's not our job to figure out the problem which is causing what we're attempting to fix. It's just our problem to continue to move forward. And that's that's something that's going to have to be dealt with.
We can put all the blame on how governments react, but honestly, like, it's a two-way street. Like, the government can react poorly, but we have to react better as well. Like, as people, like, we're the ones that are actually, like, fall for the ploy of, like, some stupid social issue that doesn't really, like, matter that much in the long term or as a whole. We're the ones that basically, like, that will literally, like, abandon friends and family if they have a different political opinion. We're the ones that, change our Facebook shader every single time a disaster happens. Like, that's going to help anything. Like, it's as much on us as it is much on the government.
Yeah,
Well,
and
ideally, the government should be the representatives of us who represent our interests.
That's
So
true, actually.
we should be the ones who not only strive to do well, but should hold the government to the standard that we hold ourselves to.
right. And as we continue to degrade the standard that we hold our government to, and to degrade the standard that we hold ourselves to, our society continues to falter. I mean, we elect people that don't attempt to solve the problems that are going on, and then I don't know. It's a big problem, and I don't know exactly how you would go about solving it, but
The late 2010s would definitely be a few years to remember. That's for sure.
we live in interesting times. I
Yeah.
think that this is going to go down as it's definitely going to go down as one of the most studied times in history, just because there's so much information to attempt to absorb. But I think that our denial of reality and the manifold pathways of that denial in our society will be one of the most interesting topics in future history, assuming that
Definitely. I can't wait to fucking be in the documentaries talking about this shit. I really can't wait.
Well, yeah, assuming that it doesn't all just collapse and that we have to have a reset.
Assuming that I don't end up in a gulag or something.
Yeah. So, FEMA camp prisoner number 1278, what do you think about the 2010s?
They were a perfect time. I was a degenerate. I am sorry. I must apologize to the women.
Because we're getting every day we grow more and more frighteningly close to the late Roman Empire. They paid people to be voters. They took all of the jobs away from the average person and gave them to mega farms and industrial centers. They replaced the soldiers with foreign-born citizens, and I don't know how many parallels we're going to have to draw before we come to the same conclusion, but that's kind of the whole point of history, is to not let things repeat. So
honestly, my parallels was more of like the late 60s, early 70s. Like, we're experiencing basically the Nixon era, where like a lot of the violence is starting to clap down.
Well, it's interesting because we are experiencing that, but it's also quite diluted. Like,
Yeah,
there was severe unrest at that period, especially in the
yeah.
United States, and you had groups of people battling in the streets. And on the one side were the hard hats who were on the right, and they wanted environments where they could continue their work because they literally wore hard hats. They were industrial workers, factory workers,
Mhm.
artisans, people like that. And on the other side, you had the hippies, and they were
The Yippies are the
useless
fucking most
bourgeois.
hilarious movie I've ever seen.
Yeah, they were the useless bourgeois faggots,
Yeah, they were fucking hilarious.
and the fights that the hard hats and the hippies got into in the streets in the 60s and 70s make the skirmishes between the alt-right and Antifa look like child's play.
Oh yeah, it was
And
full on.
yeah, and
I'd make the argument
the
the fights have basically moved to like online spaces rather than in real life for the most part.
yeah, I've heard that argument made before, and that the internet is a diffusal of real life impulses and feelings, and that it's something of a tool for control in the sense that people can go onto their message board and can
Mm.
talk about the ideas that they like, and it puts up a partition between them and reality in a way that allows for the people controlling the flow of history to continue unabated. And
One
I
of the
think that
signs. Sorry, continue.
I was just gonna say I think there's something to that.
One of the signs of a healthy society is that it has a good immune system against degenerate ideals. And I think what you were talking about in regards to like the clash between the hard hats and the hippies in the early 70s, uh, defense mechanism where you have a group of people who recognize that here's a movement, i.e., the hippies and the Marxists, who are a threat to our way of life and are a threat to our civilization, and we have to resist against it. And that was like the violence that was expressed at that time was an exhibition of that immune system in action. Whereas today, you don't have that immune system because we have a sick society that has no values and is taught that the only true value that we have is capitulation to our own destruction. And so that's why we have a complete lack of any physical resistance towards things in our society. Like you have something like what happened back in August with Unite the Right, where we had like 120 people show up to a park saying that they don't want a statue torn down, and this is portrayed in the media as the worst thing ever since 1945. Like,
Or like
give me a break.
even on a smaller scale, like Ben Shapiro, the most fucking moderate conservative, most well thought out, and totally against violence in every single metric, basically having to pay like security in the several thousands just to speak at a university. Like that's
Yeah,
retarded.
Yeah.
that's
But
a really interesting idea, though. The idea of the immune system of the society and it's failing because the hard hats weren't quite like the alt-right. They weren't people that were forming around a specific ideology in the idea of bringing it out to the public. They were literally people that wanted their society to continue and their legitimacy within that society to continue. And it's interesting because even the pathogens, I guess you could call them the hippies then and the Antifa now, have um, degraded, and so
oh yeah, they're
even
basically pathetic. They're pathetic at this point.
right because like we like to shit on hippies
But
and
their ideas are the ones that hold power.
right, but I'm
That's
just
the
trying to
problem.
make the point that
I know the reason why they hold power is because they allow they basically allow they allow them to air their grievances at acceptable targets.
right, yeah, and I've tried to make that point before that people want something to hate, and that one of the points of a government or a group of leaders is to secure a release valve for hatred. And so when people are told you're allowed to hate racists, homophobes, bigots, that kind of thing, it legitimizes their negative feelings as opposed to challenging them, which is extremely dangerous. But just the point I was trying to make was that the hippies, we like to shit on them, and it's good that you do, but they were setting off bombs, like literal TNT, hard ass bombs, and they were hurting lots of people. And between 1971 and 1972, there was 2,500 different bombs set off across the country. And at one point, New York City was called Fear City. And so even when our immune system was stronger, even the opposition was stronger. And everything today feels so lethargic. Like, looking at Antifa, it seems kind of bad or whatever, but when you put it into context of similar groups that have existed previously, even they are moving in slow motion compared to the hippie movement in the 60s and the communists in the 40s and the anarchists in the 20s. So it's like everything is slowly decaying.
I would even argue
those ideas are decaying, if anything.
I would even argue that in 2018, the Antifa are the immune system, because their ideas are the ones that are enshrined in the system, in academia, in politics, in the media. And so they're the ones who are reacting against what they perceive to be an invasion of their values.
That's interesting. That does make sense.
That makes sense. I don't believe that they're the immune system, though, because they basically want to destroy the society and make a anarcho-communist society.
Well, they want to sustain the society that they see as having been previously erected. Like, I can guarantee you that if you went up to any Antifa supporter and you asked them whether or not they supported President Obama, they would say yes.
Yeah.
Except for maybe a few of the fringe ones. But yeah, I do like the analogy of society as an organism, and I guess I've never really thought about the because that's something that happened in France in 1848. In 1830, they had a revolution, and it was suppressed because the people didn't actually want it. But then they brought back the king, and it wasn't very effective, and the average person wasn't better off. And in 1848, there was a spike revolution that just happened, and the people rose up, and there was nobody there to stop them, and the king fled, and it was over, and there was very little resistance, if any. The barricades went up, the barricades went down, and the French kingdom was a sick society, and it was immediately taken over by a pathogen. And so the idea of a cultural or ideological immune system which attempts to suppress invasive concepts. I don't know, I like that.
A similar thing happened during the Russian Revolution, because Nicholas II was he was a very ineffectual ruler, right? Often if you ask the communists, it would be like 90% of the wealth was owned by 10% of the people. Was like, yeah, that's because it was a monarchy. That's how it runs.
Yeah. Well, he was supposed to enact a constitution, and he failed to do so.
Yeah, and if you look at how the system was and how industrialized everything was, they were way behind. It wasn't a matter of what would Nicholas II be able to fucking keep this country together. It was more or less, when will this country fail?
Yeah, and the White Russians weren't an ideologically cohesive group so much as they were people who didn't fucking want to be in a communist dictatorship.
Yeah, even on the red side, there were multiple factions. It's just that the communist Bolsheviks basically more or less. They were basically when Lenin. What happened was that it was just a horrible time in Russia, right? And army soldiers were defecting, abandoned posts. Everyone, there were riots in the streets, and all Lenin did was just come in and just organize everything with Trotsky and Stalin. That's basically what happened.
Even then, at that point, there were what was called the left communists, which I think is one of the most hilarious.
The left communists.
The left communists were in opposition to Lenin and to Trotsky and eventually Stalin before they all got purged and killed. But yeah, so even their own movement had its own sort of attempt to push out what they saw as a negative viewpoint.
And now they're in charge of the state of Canada.
So, yeah. Go to the bread line, brother.
Well, I mean, you say that, but Trotsky
the
did
bread line
retire
right
in
now.
Mexico.
Yeah.
I think that was one of the greatest failings of the United States. Was
You mean they let him go to Mexico?
yeah, I mean, well, when Huerta took over in like 1916, the United States was having an election, and the Republican was like, "Yeah, we have a military, and we should use it for intervention in Mexico because a strong Mexico will make a strong America." And the people that supported, what's that fucking asshole's name? Whatever, Woodrow Wilson. They said they were all war hawks and they wanted to go to war in Europe. But so it was a choice by the American people whether to intervene in Mexico and to save them from becoming a communist nation, which they were until he died in like 1970 something. It was really ridiculous, and the modern Mexican state to this
country.
Yes, they were taken over. They weren't part of the Comintern. But
okay.
they had a socialist uprising, and Huerta was a Marxist, and he did reorganize the Mexican state along Marxist principles and formed something of a far left dictatorship, and it lasted in really horrible terms until the 70s, and then they had about 20 years of turmoil, and then they had a civil war in 1995 where the people at the bottom had been crushed for so long that they just wanted to rise up and to throw off the yoke of their oppression. And the United States and Canada were crafting NAFTA at the time, and so they were writing all these articles about how great Mexico was and how stable their government was, and they were quietly supporting the government to put down the people because they needed Mexico to look like it was stable. And rather than deal with the problem, which they had ignored 90 years ago, they chose to pretend like nothing had ever happened and like it was a perfectly stable and rational place. And that's one of the huge failings of NAFTA. That's one of the huge failings of the United States. And that is something that today is a problem that we're dealing with. And it's a problem we might not be able to deal with because it might have taken us 100 years to get Mexico back to a stable position. And instead we chose to ignore them and then exploit them. So, but yeah, there was a massive civil war in Mexico that was happening where hundreds of thousands of people were being killed at the exact same time as the NAFTA negotiations.
Jesus Christ.
It's just one of those ironies of history.
Yeah.
Well, I guess it makes sense why the current Mexican government is so opposed to Donald Trump renegotiating NAFTA, right? Because
I think that has more to do with his wall, Tom. I think that has more to do with like, you know, how he talks about Mexico rather than like the past so much.
Well, they aren't sending their best.
Yeah. Might be sending the rapists.
Yeah, they're sending their rapists and their criminals. And some of them, I assume, are good people. I love it. I'm sorry. Like, I know.
I love this. Honestly, it's just a good, like, a good punch. Donald Trump is a good punch in the system. He really is.
He might be a stepping stone towards reformation, which would be fantastic. But like the choice between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump was so fucking obvious to me.
Yeah, it was really funny, like, in hindsight, how many people were, like, lying to themselves that Hillary was, like, a popular candidate. It's like, Hillary Clinton, fucking, I'm surprised that when she drinks water, she doesn't fizzle out like a robot. Like,
the choice to me was like, well, either Donald Trump does what he says and we get better, or he doesn't and we have 4 to 8 years of relatively little happen, which isn't a big deal, or we get Hillary Clinton, who knows exactly what she wants to do and is going to fuck shit up. And I was like, well, neither one of the Trump options sound bad. Like, even if he doesn't know what he's doing, all that that's going to result in is nothing happening. And I would like for the government to not interfere with me for 4 to 8 years. So let's do it.
Yeah, I mean,
Honestly,
I don't like Donald Trump. I definitely think he was preferable to Hillary Clinton, but I do think that he functions as like a pressure release valve for a lot of the tensions that are boiling up across Western countries. And I'm not entirely convinced that he's going to make any long-lasting changes. I think he's just going to slow down the inevitable decline.
Sure. And then the question becomes, is that all that we can do now? Or, I
definitely like the fact that Donald Trump is basically the guy shouting the emperor is wearing no clothes politically.
yeah,
I feel like that needed to be for a while. Just calling out everyone's bullshit just all at once.
it's going to be an interesting next couple of years, but
A fucking hilarious next couple of years, Harvey. Fucking be optimistic.
I've enjoyed it. That's all I can say.
Oh yeah,
But
join the club.
I think
Beautiful.
we've gone on for a little while. So, do you guys want to have any closing statements on whatever topic that it is that you think we talked about?
Drugs are bad. Okay, stay away from them. Your brain will turn into an egg if you take too much of them. Stop injecting the marijuanas. That's my final statement.
Excellent.
Right, you, Tom.
Is ask your doctor about Oxycontin for pain relief.
Especially if you have minor knee troubles.
Yeah.
If you're feeling a little down, Oxycontin is your way to go.
Yeah. If you're too bariatric that your knees are giving out and you need to ride around on a mobility scooter, then yeah, take those Oxycontin pills. They'll make you feel better.
If you're an alcoholic, Oxycontin is the right drug for you.
Yeah.
And with that, I think that we've said more than enough. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a good night.
Yeah, gosh, dude.